Today's hearing is in a hybrid format. Dr. Malinsky, Mr. Wade, Mr. Michel, and Mrs. Guzman are in person. Ms. Habernick is appearing virtually. Members have the option to appear either in person or virtually. For the witnesses joining, once you start speaking, there'll be a slight delay before you're displayed on the screen. To minimize background noise, please click the mute button until it's your turn to speak, and you'll have in front of you a box with the time on it. For those joining virtually, you'll have a bell ring when you have 30 seconds left. And if there's a technology issue, Cameron and our staff will move to the next issue or remember until it's resolved. No matter who you are, no matter where you live, at some point you've probably watched as an aging parent or grandparent has found it harder and harder to move around their house. Going up the stairs gets a little more difficult. Hard to reach places to clean, while never fun, become impossible, almost impossible places to reach. Impossible to reach places. You start calling in parents and grandparents a little more often to make sure they're okay. When driving is no longer an option, trips to the grocery store or church become next to impossible. This story plays out in more and more families as one of the largest generations in our history, the baby boomers, gets older. In 2019, 1 in 7 Americans was over 65. By 2040, it will be 1 in 5. As people live longer, the homes and communities where they've made their lives and where they want to stay aren't keeping up. Across the country, whether you rent or own, housing is too expensive and not accessible enough to meet the needs of the growing number of older adults. While most seniors own their own home, homeownership isn't offering the financial protection in many cases as it used to. A smaller share of seniors own their homes today than did in previous generations, and more of today's senior homeowners are still paying a mortgage. Seniors who rent have even less to fall back on. We knew that Black and brown home households face barriers to home ownership and are more likely to rent their homes. That leaves more seniors than ever realizing they can't stay in their homes without some kind of assistance. HUD, local governments, nonprofits just can't keep up. In 2017, and many of you have heard these statistics, this committee certainly has, before the pandemic, 10 million seniors paid more than 30% of their income for housing. That's an all-time high. 5 million of these households paid over half their income in housing. We know what that does to young families. We know what it does to older people. With less money left over each month, it's too expensive for older renters and homeowners to do the renovations and modifications they would need to keep their homes safe and affordable. Things like adding a ramp or grab bars or weatherizing to save on heat bills. My old friend Tom Harkin, who served with Senator Toomey and me in the Senate, once told me the other day, Tom is in his early 80s, he said the secret to a long life is a handrail. And it was kind of funny, but it's kind of not. 10%, only 10% of homes are accessible with people with mobility challenges that come with age. If your home isn't safe, you can't afford to make it safe. It leaves seniors really with one final choice, and that is to go into a nursing home. That's often more expensive and may be more care than they want or need. The challenges facing seniors today shouldn't be a surprise. We've been watching baby boomers age for decades. We've really done nothing that meets the scale of this change. Back in 2014, Dr. Malinsky's organization, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, warned that the existing housing stock is unprepared to meet the escalating need for affordability, accessibility, social connectivity, and supportive services. The report concluded the time to act is now, but that was 2014, right? It's 8 years later, we haven't acted. People around the country who work with seniors, who work on these issues, know what could help us meet this challenge. Today we'll hear from Dr. Habernick, who will be with us from Nevada, about investments in affordable housing and services, food delivery, transportation, helping thousands of seniors in Nevada stay in their community without crippling rent payments. We'll also hear from Mrs. Guzman about how communities are making investments that help seniors modify their homes to age in place and in the kind of services in transit that make it possible for older adults to stay in their home and stay active in their communities. Unfortunately, that's been far too little investment and efforts that could make a world of difference, save money, millions of Americans for their families. We have legislation that would make the investments we need to fix that. We need to invest in additional housing and services to support low-income senior renters and help seniors do the basic improvements they need to stay in their home. We need to give communities the tools to address local barriers to building more homes that fit the needs of an aging population. We need to combine these efforts with reducing prescription costs and strengthening Medicare that will allow seniors a little financial breathing room. These Americans have worked hard their whole lives. Many have scraped by. They want to age with dignity in communities they love, near family and friends. It's really what we all aspire to. It's why we created Social Security in the 30s and Medicare in the 60s. It's why we fight today against ending them within 5 years. And it's why we need these investments in senior housing today. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of our witnesses. I think we've had at least 6 hearings on housing this Congress, including 2 just on private equity's minor role in housing. But there's been one topic, however, that's been a conspicuous omission. We've not had a single hearing on the government's role in driving up housing costs. In the last 16 months, this administration, with the cooperation of Democrats in Congress, have dropped hundreds of billions of dollars in helicopter money to stimulate an already strong economy. $80 billion went to rental assistance. That's $80 billion above all the ordinary spending in this space, went to rental assistance, vouchers, and other housing subsidies. It comes to hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And despite record demand, the Fed continued to artificially hold down mortgage rates at near record lows. So just as this administration has given us the highest inflation in 40 years, it's also given us these astonishing increases in housing costs. House prices skyrocketed almost 17% in the last year, 17%, while rents jumped about 12%. Now, some of my colleagues seem to be willfully blind to government's role in driving this inflation. The problem is actually bigger than that. Across these 6 housing hearings that we've had, this committee has spent most of its time seemingly grasping for justifications to spend even more of taxpayer money and expand government's role further. Now, setting aside the question of whether the federal government should have a role in the housing market, we should at least ask ourselves, do we really need to spend even more taxpayer money on housing? I think a more skeptical framework should guide us in these hearings. Whether in housing or otherwise, we ought to ask ourselves, what exactly is the market failure that we're trying to correct? And we should ask whether taxpayers' already generous safety net is somehow still inadequate. And in answering these questions, we should bear in mind the risk that the government solution will be worse than the problem. The risk of government failure is particularly acute when it comes to housing. The number and cost of housing subsidies that are already existing boggles the mind. There is the mortgage interest deduction, capital gains exclusion on home sales, tax deduction on property taxes, VHA, VA, USDA, mortgage insurance, and Ginnie mortgage-backed securities guarantees, down payment assistance. There's the low-income housing tax credit program. Then there's also this overlapping array of HUD programs, including project-based rental assistance, tenant-based rental assistance, public housing, Section 202 housing for the elderly, Section 811 housing for persons with disabilities, Section 521 rural rental housing, CDBG, home block grants, homelessness assistance, and then we have the GSEs, which subsidize more than half of all single-family mortgage debt, and I've probably left out a few. But look, after 50 years, and many hundreds of billions, maybe well over $1 trillion in subsidies, there's been no meaningful change in home ownership rates. In 1970, the home ownership rate in America was 64%. Today, it's 65%. Black ownership levels are similar today to when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. These government policies spent an enormous amount of money, but they've mostly just made housing more expensive. The inference is inescapable. When it comes to housing, government has often been the problem, not the solution. Today, we're likely to hear that the government should further subsidize senior citizens' ability to age in place. Now, to the extent that seniors want to stay in their homes, it's certainly their right, and very understandably, that's a very strong preference for a lot of seniors. Completely understandable. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it often makes perfect sense for seniors to decide to maybe move out of a 3 or 4 bedroom, 2-story house where they raise their children. Many seniors downsize to apartments, to mother-in-law suites, or to smaller homes. And in many cases, the seniors had already built up significant home equity, and so by selling their house, they have new and sometimes very significant resources relative to all of their other resources that they can use for any purpose they see fit. So my point is that downsizing can be a good thing for the senior, but also beyond that, because when a senior chooses to downsize, a new home comes on the market. Maybe the buyer will be a young couple looking to start a family. And this turnover helps to match a scarce resource to its highest and best use. So we should just be careful about any government interventions that might offset this natural set of reasonable choices that are available to people. To reduce inflation and make housing more affordable, we ought to pursue reforms that will leverage the power of free enterprise, increase housing supply, and make markets more competitive. In January, the chairman reiterated the housing finance reform principles that he released in 2019. His principles overlap considerably with the reform principles that I've released. I hope to be able to work with the chairman to develop a bipartisan consensus on this critical issue. Meanwhile, I hope the administration will finally engage on housing reform. Treasury has still not met its obligation to deliver a reform plan to Congress, and it's now 6 months overdue. So instead of seeking out any excuse or pretext to regulate more and spend more, the administration should look to opportunities for bipartisan legislation like housing finance reform that relies on free enterprise, not government, to make housing more affordable for more Americans, including seniors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I'll introduce the 5 witnesses. Dr. Jennifer Malinsky is the Project Director of the Housing and Aging Society Program at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Ms. Audra Hammernick is the President and CEO of Nevada HAND. She is joining us from Nevada, a nonprofit organization providing affordable housing and supportive services to low-income families and individuals in Southern Nevada. Senator Cortez Masto would like to have introduced you, Ms. Hammernick, but she will be here in a few moments to ask questions. Thomas Wade is the Director of Financial Services and Housing Policy at the American Action Forum. He joins us here in person. Mr. Norbert Michel is the Vice President and Director of the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. He will be joining us, I believe, from his office in Washington. And Mrs. Shannon Guzman is a Senior Strategy Policy Advisor with the AARP Public Policy Institute working on housing. She was previously a Senior Planner in County Government in Maryland. Dr. Malinsky, if you would begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. I'm Jennifer Malinsky, Project Director of the Housing and Aging Society Program at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies. This is a critical moment in which to consider investments in the housing needs of the nation's older adults. While the number of people 65 and over has increased dramatically since the first baby boomers reached that age a decade ago, in just 3 years, the leading edge of that cohort turns 80. By 2035, the Census Bureau projects that the population 80 and over will grow to nearly 24 million people, fully doubling from 2016. Many of these older adults will live alone and on limited incomes, and many will have mobility and other health challenges. Demand for affordable, accessible housing, in-home services, and neighborhood supports and amenities is set to soar, yet right now we fall well short of meeting even today's needs. Without concerted action, we are on track for even graver deficiencies that may diminish older people's health and ability to remain in their communities, increase the cost of public programs, and exacerbate deep and long-standing inequalities. I'll highlight 4 specific challenges in my remarks. First, there is enormous unmet need for affordable rental housing for older adults. Over 10 million households headed by someone 65 and over are cost-burdened, paying more than a third of their income on housing. Half of these pay more than 50%. Nearly 3/4 of renters earning under $15,000 a year are cost-burdened. To compensate, households often cut back on food and medical care and medicine, which can be detrimental to those with chronic health conditions. Renters, often on fixed incomes, are particularly at risk of rising housing costs and have a much smaller personal safety net. In 2019, the median older adult renter had a net wealth under $6,000. At last measure, over 2.2 million older, very low-income renter households had worst-case housing needs, defined as having severe cost burdens, living in severely inadequate housing, or both. Only 36% of income-eligible older adults receive federal housing assistance, and trends point to greater demand for support in coming years. The number of income-eligible households will increase with population growth and widening income disparities, and rentership rates are rising, in part because people now nearing retirement were particularly hard hit by the foreclosure crisis. Expanding rental assistance can provide needed stability to these households, but also address a growing homelessness crisis among older adults. Affordability challenges are disproportionately felt by older people of color. Long-standing disparities in access to well-paying jobs and homeownership opportunities have resulted in steep gaps in homeownership with white households and greater financial insecurity, particularly for older Black and Hispanic households. Second, very little of the nation's housing stock offers even the most basic of accessibility features. Our analysis shows that less than 4% of the nation's stock offers a no-step entry, single-floor living, and wide enough hallways and doorways to accommodate a wheelchair. Older people are most likely to report difficulties entering, navigating, and using different parts of their homes. Support is needed for renters and property owners, as well as older homeowners, to make modifications and maintain housing in safe condition. Third, the need for assistance and services that support older adults with activities of daily living and household tasks is escalating. Service-enriched affordable housing has been shown to support independence, reduce health care costs, but need outstrips demand. Demand will grow for supports and services delivered to middle-income older adults who typically cannot afford assisted living. Fourth, our research shows that many older adults live in places that lack livability features such as neighborhood services, transportation alternatives, safe streets, and opportunities for engagement. These all contribute to well-being and can even combat isolation and loneliness, which are both serious health issues in their own right. Housing options are part of livability, particularly for those seeking to remain in their communities when their current home no longer fits their needs. But options can be few in high-cost locations and in suburban and rural communities dominated by single-family homes, in part due to zoning barriers. We can address the challenges I've outlined with comprehensive and coordinated policies to build, preserve, and retrofit affordable housing, assist owners and landlords with accessibility modifications, connect housing with supports, services, and transportation, and help communities thrive. We can ensure that the oldest people in our nation have housing that provides a sound foundation for a good quality of life. But the time to act is now. The need is already great and will only become more so. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malinsky. Ms. Hamernack is with us from Nevada, remote from Nevada. Ms. Hamernack, welcome.
Housing developer, and we happen to be a not-for-profit agency. We're dedicated to the financing, development, construction, and management of high-quality, affordable apartment homes. Over the last 29 years, Nevada Hand has constructed 35 apartment communities that house over 8,000 residents in over 4,700 units of rental housing. We've been able to build these housing units using low-income housing tax credit program, home funds, National Housing Trust Fund, and other local and state federal resources. We have 11 family communities, the only 2 affordable assisted living communities in Nevada, and 22 senior communities housing over 2,900 seniors. For over 25 years, I've worked in local government, led a housing finance agency, and now leading a nonprofit in my experiences in real estate, financial services, and social impact lending. Today, I want to present to you the model of resident services we use at Nevada Hand, the need for affordable housing, especially for seniors, and the barriers and a few solutions that we are considering in Nevada. At Nevada Hand, we build affordable housing, but at every one of our communities, we provide support to every single tenant. Our resident services focus on 4 things: financial stability, education, health and wellness, and community engagement. We provide on-site food pantries, transportation services, wellness fairs, vaccine clinics, health and wellness programs, chair yoga, senior sneakers, walking club, all things that combat isolation and create community. But I really want to talk to you about the need. Nevada has the most significant housing need in the United States. We have the lowest statewide supply. We have the lowest metro area supply in Southern Nevada, Las Vegas area, and we have the highest cost burden. 82% of seniors are extremely low income renters. Nevada has a shortage of roughly 84,000 units of affordable housing. And we, just at Nevada Hand, are receiving 2,000 calls a day from seniors. And last week, we had 10 vacancies. So out of the 700 units we have under construction right now, and we have an additional 200 that we're rehabbing, we realize it's a drop in the bucket when there's 84,000 units in need that we need to create. Across the country, there's approximately 36% renter households. In Nevada, that's 45% renter households. And the current median rent right now in Las Vegas is $1,600 a month, while we're able to provide rents at an average of $733 a month. And that's the power of the tax credit program. So according to the National Home Builders, building 100 units of affordable housing creates lots of economic impact for the community. 11 million in local income, 2.2 in taxes and revenues, and creates 161 local jobs. That's just for 100 units built. But there are some barriers. Land availability, too few tax credits, too few housing choice vouchers, and now material costs are really a big impact. In Nevada, over 80% of the land is owned by the federal government. We know that Senator Cortez Masto has introduced the Southern Nevada Economic Development and Conservation Act bill that will provide lands for conservation, but also for affordable housing. Out of our 35 developments, we can see that one was built on land that was transferred by BLM. And we're competing for land in the open marketplace with residential, non-residential, and very rarely are we competing with other folks doing affordable housing work. It's usually luxury housing. And there really is a lack of tax credits. In our deals, the tax credit equity equals around 75–80% of our capital stack to actually build the apartments. Due to the number of tax credits allocated to Nevada, we're able to build one community a year using the 9% round. And an increase in credit simply means an increase in affordable housing. There is also a lack of housing choice vouchers. 82% of extremely low-income renters in Nevada are cost burdened, and we are not surprised by that number. Funding for rental assistance is not equal across the states. Currently, many housing programs allocate resources based on population, let's say the low-income housing tax credit program, but that's not the case for housing choice vouchers. The formula has not changed. So we are getting the same level of housing choice vouchers allocated to Nevada from the beginning of time. And it really isn't fair for high growth population areas. And I have to mention material cost. A unit that we could build in November of 2020 for $94,000, that same unit costs us now $147,000. $94,000 to $147,000. That's a 55% increase in 16 months. And this just results in less units being built. So in conclusion, the need is great. We have supply and demand issues. There are barriers, but they are solvable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. West is recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of appearing before you today to discuss the housing challenges facing America's seniors and all Americans. I'd like to summarize my written testimony by making 3 major points. First, increased government intervention in the housing market has in many, if not most cases, done more harm than good. Congressional subsidies and agency policies have a patchy record of success at best, and homeownership rates remain roughly the same as they did in the 1970s, as Senator Toomey mentioned. Further congressional action will continue to artificially distort the free market, reducing the ability of private actors to compete. This lowers the quality of services, reduces availability, and increases the prices of available homes, all while increasing the systemic risk present in the housing ecosystem at a time of significant market stress. Second, no specific policies for addressing the housing needs of seniors can offset the negative impact of a poor macroeconomic environment. Due to prior policy errors, the United States is facing inflation levels previously unseen in a generation, which harm seniors and vulnerable populations the most. Congress would be better placed to form a more complete understanding of the current state of existing subsidies, both of existing housing and urban development initiatives and COVID-19 grants, from which a significant amount of funding remains unspent. We learned from the Department of Treasury yesterday that little over half of federal rental aid has been dispersed at this point in the pandemic. Third and finally, further demand-side subsidies fail to account for, and indeed instead exacerbate, the 2 primary underlying causes of stress in the housing market, a lack of supply and the role played by the government-sponsored enterprises, or GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If Congress must intervene in the functioning of the free market to meet specific policy goals, it must do so on the supply side, for example, by changing local zoning regulations or investigating the barriers to construction and continuing the efforts to end the conservatorship of the GSEs. By contrast, demand subsidies increase aggregate demand, which results in a rise in house prices, making housing unaffordable to those who need it most. Congress may achieve precisely the opposite of what it sets out to do. And if you'll forgive me for ending on a personal note, a month ago I had the privilege of taking the oath of allegiance and nationalizing as an American citizen. So the ability to perform my civic duty today is particularly meaningful. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Congratulations. Perhaps people naturalize give shorter testimonies too, so thank you for that. Not to make light of anybody else's testimony. Norm Michelle is with us, I believe, from his office in Washington. Mr. Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today. I'm the Vice President and Director for our Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. The views that I express in this testimony are my own, and they should not be construed as representing any official position of the Cato Institute. In my testimony today, I argue that the best way to make housing more affordable is for the federal government to reverse course on policies that increase demand. These policies make goods and services, including housing, less affordable because they artificially boost demand in supply-constrained markets. And I'll expand on this argument with three main points. First, the level of federal involvement in housing has been escalating for decades along with housing costs, and that correlation is no accident. Combined, Fannie, Freddie, and the FHA have been behind more than half of outstanding mortgage debt per year for decades, in some years responsible for a share of close to 70%. From 2009 to 2020, Fannie and Freddie's annual share of the total mortgage-backed securities market averaged 70%, including Ginnie Mae in that total. The federal share has averaged 92% per year from 2009 to 2020. Virtually all of these federal housing policies, even those outside of the GSEs and FHA, are geared toward increasing demand, usually through leverage. Because housing markets are almost always supply constrained, these policies consistently put upward pressure on prices and rents. They include everything from supporting the GSEs to providing housing allowances to military and other government employees, as well as providing Section 8 vouchers. The economic principles are the same for assistance and subsidies that pay for housing. They place upward pressure on prices because they increase the number of dollars chasing the same amount of housing. My second point is that Congress's spending since 2020 and the Biden administration's policies, including those announced in the newest budget, only worsen the effects of these pre-existing federal policies, particularly when it comes to housing costs. In housing markets, we will continue to have artificially heightened demand. And that promises to increase housing costs for all Americans, both young and old. These policies continue to move the U.S. housing market further in the wrong direction. Separate from housing, the spending bills include all kinds of examples of wasteful government spending, examples that most people would object to, even in the absence of the extremely high inflation that we have now. These policies include things like millions of dollars sent to Vermont for an Institute for Rural Partnerships and a cattle contracts library, $3 million for a fishermen's co-op facility in Guam, $2.75 million for an innovation center in Waverly, New York, another $2.5 billion to Vermont to build a new museum in St. Johnsbury, $5 million for an electric substation in Delaware, $2 million to reduce inequity in access to solar power, and $10 million to tear down an abandoned hotel in Fairbanks, Alaska. And this list is just the tip of the iceberg. The federal deficit is now close to $3 trillion, and deficit spending, whether on museums or infrastructure classically defined, boosts demand while doing nothing to address supply constraints. And it leads to more inflation while not fixing the underlying problems that created the inflation in the first place. It is disturbing that Congress continued to spend in this manner, even in the face of fraud and rapidly rising inflation, and we're now seeing those results. As I and many others warned in June of 2021, persistently high levels of debt and deficit spending typically lead to inflation, and Congress has done nothing to fix this problem. They've only made it worse. Last, the Federal Reserve has contributed to higher housing costs by continuing to support the secondary market, and therefore fueling more leverage to buy homes in a low interest rate environment. Prior to the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed rarely held any mortgage-backed securities on its balance sheet. Now it acts as though it can't operate without holding massive quantities of GSE-issued mortgage-backed securities. Between 2010 and 2022, the lowest amount held was $827 billion, and the Fed went from holding $1.4 trillion in March of 2020 to $2.7 trillion in March of 2022. In the face of a rapidly rising CPI and steadily rising home prices, this mortgage-backed security purchase policy makes very little sense. Thank you for your consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Michel. Mrs. Guzman is welcome. 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the Senate Banking Committee. My name is Shannon Guzman, Senior Strategic Policy Advisor in the AARP Public Policy Institute. Thank you for the opportunity to address the urgent housing needs of America's older adults. Housing is precarious for too many older adults and their families. For over a decade, AARP has been focused on how to foster communities that can support a diverse aging population. The AARP Livability Index scores every neighborhood in the U.S. for what people need most. Our state offices advocate for state and local policies to advance housing that help people age in place. The AARP Community Challenge Grant Program has invested over $9 million in more than 800 grants across all states. The AARP network of age-friendly states and communities empowers residents and leaders with information to make better choices in ways that benefit residents of all ages. We do this because the number of people aged 65 and older will exceed the number of children under 18 for the first time in U.S. history in 2034. Over the next 20 years, 85% of new households will be headed by someone aged 65 and older. And the majority of older adults consistently tell AARP that they want to age in their homes and communities. However, we should remember that the median income for an older adult in 2019 was just over $27,000. And in that same year, nearly 1 in 10 people aged 65 and older lived in poverty. Older adults are not a homogeneous group. They are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, with about 20% over age 65 still working. At the same time, health conditions often become more challenging as the risk of developing disabilities increases with age. The need for accessible and affordable housing is therefore growing, not only for older adults who want to remain independent, but for the 48 million family caregivers who care for them. The housing challenges of older adults are part of a larger national housing crisis. Both housing and rental markets have experienced significant price increases recently. Higher property taxes due to rising home values and higher priced basic goods due to inflation are putting a financial strain on older adult households, who are more likely to be retired and living on fixed incomes. As a result, evictions and homelessness among older Americans are on the rise, and home ownership rates are falling for every age group. Racial disparities are evident in these trends, and the pandemic has only increased housing instability among older adults, with many behind in their rent or mortgage payments. In the statement we have submitted for record, we offer numerous policy solutions that can be considered at the federal, state, and local level. In particular, we urge Congress to strengthen the Section 202 and Section 8 programs, invest in public housing and supportive services, and urge more rigorous enforcement of the Fair Housing Act and the restoration of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Loss mitigation for reverse mortgage borrowers, and federal incentives to spur local and state zoning reform to encourage more accessory dwelling units and manufactured housing could also be of great benefit. Finally, both public and private efforts to promote home modifications to improve accessibility, including AARP's own Home Fit guides and initiative with Lowe's, can help older adults stay in their homes and communities. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today on the housing challenges facing older adults, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Guzman. Let me start with Dr. Malinsky. When a senior spends more on housing than she can afford, what kinds of things get cut out? What's the effect of these budget cuts?
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's a dramatic decrease in spending on healthcare, so out-of-pocket healthcare, which can include medication, co-pays, food and transportation, and to the extent that people are still working, saving for retirement dries up. So we've compared extremely low-income renters who are severely cost-burdened with those who are affordably housed, and they are spending, those who are severely cost-burdened are spending about half on food and out-of-pocket medical costs.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Guzman, we know that eviction and foreclosure can be one of the greatest tragedies inflicted on anybody in this world, but can present uniquely devastating consequences for seniors. We have spent much of our time in committee talking about foreclosures and evictions for young families. It's children go to different school districts, all the things that can happen. One of the beauties of the child tax credit, I saw someone said that because so many families struggle in the last 2 weeks of the month to pay their rent, someone wrote that the child tax credit provided people a little joy of end of the month breathing space and what that can mean for families. But talk, if you would, challenges that emerge when seniors lose their home a little differently from younger families. Talk that through with us.
Sure, I'm happy to do so. When seniors are housing cost burden, they have less of an opportunity to be able to pay for the services and goods that are essential to their livelihood. And when they are faced with eviction or foreclosure, that teeters them on the edge of homelessness. And when someone who is older loses their home, it's harder for them to recover. They may have to leave their community. They've stayed in their community for a very long time and made social connections and long-standing ties, and that's devastating to an older adult and their family.
Thank you. Ms. Haberneck, how important are services provided to seniors in your affordable building? How does access to supportive services help them live independently in your building and in the community?
Oh, it makes all the difference. You can either live in your apartment and feel very isolated and never go out and have health consequences, or you can be a part of a community where you're engaging in all sorts of different activities. We try to focus on health and wellness, all sorts of activities that improve community, and we know that connections help people feel better, help them move their bodies, and help them remain housed longer.
So is there a correlation between especially low income and getting out in the community? And any of the three of you answer. Start with Mr. Hamernick, Ms. Hamernick. Just talk that through. I assume the answer is yes, but I want to explore why more.
Yes, I think there's a direct connection between that and also health and housing. When you are adequately housed and you are engaging in the community, you are going to be more healthy. We're very fortunate that in many of our senior buildings, we have food pantries. So we've designed them in such a way that people gather together and they have their shopping list, and we create community and create opportunities for people to engage with each other. I'd be interested to hear what other.
Yeah, so Ms. Guzman and Dr. Malinsky, especially either of you address the she said health care or health that people's health suffers. Work mental health into that answer, would you? When people don't get out, they probably don't live as long. They probably have more mental health challenges. They're just income doesn't really allow them to get out as much. Give us some thoughts about that, Ms. Guzman and Dr. Malinsky.
Sure. There are several reasons why older adults may face social isolation. One may be due to a lack of community connection, but also because their housing doesn't work for them. There are barriers within their home that make it hard for them to connect, or they don't have access to places to socialize easily, or they may be without broadband where they could connect with people online. And this is detrimental to their mental and physical health if they cannot get out of their homes, maybe walk to the grocery store for healthy food options, to walk to a local park for exercise, or to just make those connections in the community.
Dr. Malinsky, your comments.
Yeah, loneliness and isolation have been compared to cigarette smoking in terms of their impact on physical health, early mortality, definitely depression and other mental health issues. And I just wanted to mention that for some people, the accessibility of their house is a barrier. If you cannot easily get in and out of your house, that is a problem in and of itself, let alone get to transportation or to places where you feel safe and in the public realm is accessible.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we all know senior citizens are some of the hardest hit by inflation. A few weeks ago, the president said, and I quote, "It was simply not true that the reason for inflation is the government is spending more money," end quote. The administration and some of my Democratic colleagues have blamed a lot of folks for inflation. They blame the supply chain. They try to blame corporate greed. Now they blame Vladimir Putin. But that's not necessarily the view of all the Democrat economists. The former Obama Treasury official Stephen Ratner has said, and I quote, "This is Biden's inflation and he needs to own it," end quote. That is, in fact, the way it looks to me. It looks to me like massive excess spending in recent years combined with the Fed's lax monetary policy has given us this inflationary environment. So, Mr. Michel, at a macro level, would you agree that it's not the supply chain, it's not Vladimir Putin, but at a macro level, it's been too much spending and too much easy money that has created this inflationary environment?
Yes, Senator, I agree. I don't think among economists it's very controversial that if you have persistently high levels of debt and deficit spending, you're going to get inflation. Lawrence Summers is another, I guess you would say, Democrat administration economist who has pointed this out for a while. The administration and Congress have been implementing trillions in deficit spending, $7.5 trillion in packages totaling over the last year and a half, and about a $3 trillion deficit. Doesn't matter if we call this infrastructure spending. We have to sell treasuries to finance that spending. That's money coming into the economy, and you end up with more money chasing the same amount of goods. And
So
when you throw Sorry, go ahead.
But no, I appreciate that. And I specifically asked about the macro, and you answered that. Let me follow up with a question at a more micro level. It seems to me there's a lot of data that shows a tremendous correlation between accelerating costs for higher education correlated to more government spending for higher education. And so my question is it your view that the same dynamic occurs in the housing space when government increases its spending on housing? Does that tend to increase the prices for housing?
Yes, that's my view.
And what's the mechanism?
Yes, that's my view.
What's the mechanism? Why does that happen?
Well, you were inducing demand. You're giving people more money to go out and buy houses or to take mortgages on for houses that aren't there, and they take a while to get there. Even in Audra's testimony a little while ago, she mentioned in Nevada a shortage in land. Well, you're not going to be able to do anything except increase prices on existing housing stock and construction materials if you just give people more money to go buy housing that you can't build. So that's the mechanism.
Mr. Wade, many people think of Fannie and Freddie as permanent fixtures in the American housing system. It's easy to forget that the GSEs actually played a fairly small role in American housing finance until pretty recently. At the end of 1981, I'm old enough to remember. By the way, congratulations on becoming an American citizen. 1981, the GSEs together owned or guaranteed less than 10% of single-family mortgage debt. They've since grown to more than half the market. And despite all that growth of the GSEs, there's been virtually no increase in home ownership rates. So, Mr. Wade, could you give me a sense, do you think there would be adverse effects on the housing market if the GSE's footprints were shrunk on a gradual basis?
While I couldn't promise that there wouldn't be teething issues related to weaning the economy off a decade-long addiction, if not dependency, on government support and capital, I truly believe that the free market is the most efficient mechanism by which to allocate scarce resources. And one fact that strikes me particularly hard is the evidence over the last sort of 2 decades that Fannie and Freddie have not done a better job of allocating funding to meet affordable housing goals than the free market. At the very, very least, I believe it is incumbent on Congress to ensure that Fannie and Freddie are holding enough risk to reflect holding enough capital to reflect the very real risk that they represent to the American economy. And moving into a post-GSE situation will make the economy healthier for everyone, including the most vulnerable participants.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the Urban Institute, of the 16.1 million new household formations over the next 20 years, more than 80% of them will be senior households. Due to lack of affordable housing options and lasting damage from the financial and COVID crises, many of these senior households will be renters. Dr. Malinsky, what does this significant increase in senior households mean for our senior public housing capacity and the senior housing needs that Congress should prepare for?
Thank you, Senator. Right now, over half of households living in public housing are headed by an older adult, and we certainly expect that, given the statistics that you just mentioned, that will increase. That brings with it needs for, and also I should say that only 36% of our older adults receive the rental assistance that they're income eligible for. So as we see that number of income eligible groups, households grow, we're going to see increased demand for these programs for public housing, which does provide more accessible housing than other market rate affordable rentals, and also programs like Section 202 and project-based Section 8, which provides services as well, which are going to be increasingly important.
Well, HUD's Section 202 Housing for Elderly program provides seniors, as you said, with affordable housing options and service coordinators to connect them with additional services and supports they need to age in place, which is far less costly to us than the alternatives. However, the program has been severely underfunded for over a decade. In 2010, Congress appropriated more than $450 million for the construction of new Section 202 housing. The final FY22 omnibus that was enacted earlier this month provided only $199 million. That's an enormous cut when the population is going up and we're going the opposite direction. And the president's budget for FY23 asked for even less. So I've strongly advocated for more robust funding in years past, and I hope my colleagues will join me in calling for enough funding to meet the rising needs of older Americans aging in place. Bless you, Chairman. Aging in place at the end of the day is far more dignified, far less costly to us as a society. The shortage of affordable housing is crushing our seniors. In my home state of New Jersey, one Section 202 provider has waiting lists 8 to 10 years long to get into their communities. With wait lists that long, the sad reality is that some seniors may never have the opportunity to benefit from these critical programs. Mrs. Guzman, can you describe the struggles that AARP members face when looking for affordable housing?
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Yes, I can. Older adults are having a difficult time because the affordable housing options are just not available to them in their communities. And it's what they have to pay is putting a strain on their household budgets. And so what they need are housing options, a variety of housing options that can work for them to meet them at their income levels, whatever those may be. So we advocate for accessory dwelling units, which are smaller units that can fit on an existing property of someone's home. They could be attached or detached. That can serve as a place for someone to remain in their homes. They could stay there. They could rent out their larger home. They could also supplement their retirement income by renting that unit out. So there are different ways. There's also manufactured housing as well, which is an affordable housing option. But those need both of those housing options need to be allowed in various communities across the country. And with new or reformed zoning laws, communities can add those housing types to their communities so that older adults have a place to stay. Mm-hmm.
Well, the shortage of senior housing is only going to grow over time. According to the Joint Center, 31% of 65 to 79-year-old renter households in New Jersey, for example, spend more than half of their incomes on housing. A national low-income housing coalition report says, quote, older adults are at the center of our nation's housing affordability and homelessness crisis, close quote. To me, that's a call to action. So, Dr. Malinsky, what has the Joint Center's research shown about the impact on the lowest income senior household of paying more than they can afford for their housing?
When this happens, there are cutbacks in food and medication and out-of-pocket spending on healthcare, less savings for retirement, less spent on transportation. People may be forced to make an unwanted move, which takes them away from their support networks, doubling up with family instability. And the homelessness crisis among older adults is growing. The numbers have gone up, especially among the younger baby boomers. And so we are concerned about all of these things, about displacement from one's community and one's home, and all the necessities that affect health and well-being that people forego.
Well, let me close by saying it's amazing in America that the choices are between putting food on the table, having access to your prescription drugs, and or the place that you're going to call home. And that's what these seniors are facing. We are facing both a housing affordability and a housing supply crisis. And without significant investments in successful and trusted programs like HUD Section 202, we're not going to be prepared for the coming wave of low-income senior renters. And I look forward, Mr. Chairman, to working with you on that question.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today. So, if people don't have a safe, affordable, dignified place to work, to live, then nothing else in their life works. Not their job, not their health, nothing. And we know that for many low-income people and older Americans, public housing is what makes their lives work. And in fact, I think as we've been exploring today, there are many misconceptions about who lives in public housing. In fact, as we've talked about today, more than half of our nation's public housing is occupied by people who are 65, 62 or older, or people with disabilities. So public housing is a lifeline for our nation's seniors. But here's the problem. The existing public housing stock that we have doesn't come close to fully meeting the needs of seniors, not to mention, as Ms. Malinsky is pointing out, the future needs as our population ages. So here's just one example in Minneapolis. According to the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, 68% of residents are elderly and 43% are elderly and disabled. And on top of that, the need for public housing greatly exceeds current availability for our elders. Right now in Minneapolis, we have 281 older people who are on the wait list for public housing, with almost 4,000 disabled people who are not elders also on the wait list. And this is just in one community. So Ms. Malinsky, what do we know about the situation for people who are on the waiting list for public housing, seniors who are on the waiting list for public housing right now? What is their situation? Where are they living? How long are they waiting on these waiting lists?
Thank you, Senator. Those are among the elder adults who have worst case housing needs, with severely inadequate physical housing, paying more than half their income on rent, living in places that they would prefer not to live, far from family or friends, doubling up with family or friends, instability. We don't know entirely what happens to people on the waiting list because their lives are so unstable and they move so often. So that is definitely something of concern, that their trajectory to getting off that waiting list, which can be years, it depends on the location, but can be many, many years. And some will probably not be able to access public housing in the end.
Right. I think about what that means in terms of instability, impact on people's health, the issues around social isolation that Chair Brown mentioned in his testimony, and just the deep impacts that this has on people when they already are, potentially in a very vulnerable situation. So I'm going to ask this question to Ms. Malinsky and also to Ms. Hamernick. How do you respond to the theory that the private sector, if left up to its own devices, will fill the need for affordable housing for low-income seniors? Ms. Hamernick, would you like to go first? Then I'll go back to Ms. Malinsky.
Sure. I don't think that we would have private investors putting equity not debt, equity into affordable housing if it wasn't for the low-income housing tax credit program, right? It just would not, there would be no reason to do that without the tax credit program.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Malinsky?
Yes, I think to fill the need that is faced by extremely low income older adults and households, people making under 30% of area median income, the private sector just can't make that pencil out. There needs to be subsidy to make it happen. And the nonprofits, without those subsidies, can't compete with developers who can build market rate and luxury housing.
Right. So essentially, without the support that we provide for this housing, there just is not the kind of return on investment that any rational private sector investor would face in order to build these units, because they're not profitable, right? Right. Thank you. Thank you. I just have a couple more questions. I want to just go back to Ms. Malinsky. We're actually, either one of you, I think, could be able to answer this. I have worked very hard on improving fire suppression measures in public housing, particularly in high-rise public housing. This is something that the tragedy of this we've experienced firsthand in Minneapolis, where 5 individuals were killed in a tragic fire in public housing high-rise in Minneapolis. Could you just speak briefly about the importance of safety measures, including fire suppression, in housing for seniors?
Yes, I haven't studied fire suppression in particular, but safety is incredibly important, and it ties into accessibility, that people need the house that suits their needs. And we do know that people in their late 80s have difficulties getting around and using the homes. In high rises, we have the elevator issue, and I think we saw during the pandemic many people not leaving their apartments because they didn't want to use the elevator and go into public spaces. So really, really important for older adults. And again, back to the safety issue, 3 million older adults fall every year, and this is 800,000 of whom are hospitalized. This is an incredible health priority that we must have safe and accessible housing, since most of those falls do occur in the home.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. And, we're doing fire drills in our buildings. We are looking to all sorts of accessibility features. Even if the resident doesn't need them, we're building in such a way that if they do need them, we can quickly retrofit and help them stay in place.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Smith. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I'd like to begin with a question for you, Ms. Hammernick. A quarter of the approximately 300,000 Georgians who spend more than half of their income on housing are seniors. And across the state, I hear from seniors, from community leaders, from elected officials about the acute housing shortage faced by seniors in Georgia. In Albany, Georgia, for example, there is a crisis of affordable and accessible housing for seniors. Based on your experience and your analysis, Ms. Hammernick, what policies at the federal, state, and local level will support the expansion of housing supply to serve American seniors in Albany, Georgia, across Georgia, and across the country?
It's tax credits. It's low-income housing tax credits. It's getting capital into local marketplaces, just like Georgia or anywhere else, that allows developers to put bricks and sticks projects together and build. And, tax credits are rental housing only, but it's a great option. When someone was mentioning earlier about downsizing and that being a good option, downsizing into an apartment is a great solution for many seniors, and it gets them in, especially when there's strong support services. It gets them into a real community where they're much less isolated than living at home alone.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question, please, for Dr. Malinsky and Ms. Guzman. Frequently hear from constituents that when seniors can find affordable housing, that the difficulties the operators of, in particular, senior-oriented and assisted living facilities face in sustaining their business models can pose dire challenges for seniors seeking housing. At one facility in Ackworth, Georgia, seniors were given just 3 days' notice to vacate before the senior housing facility suddenly closed. The only assisted living facility that accepts Medicaid patients in Camden County, Georgia, closed last summer, giving residents just 30 days to find a new place to live. Please, Dr. Malinsky and Ms. Guzman, why is it so difficult for senior housing providers to stay in business? Dr. Malinsky?
I was looking to Ms. Guzman. This is something I frankly haven't studied, Senator. I imagine that that there's a good deal of the costs of the health provision side, but I'm going to I'd be happy
Ms.
to
Guzman,
defer
please.
to Ms. Guzman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. The business model of assisted living facilities, I'm not very familiar with. However, when we think about the needs of older adults and their housing choices, whether or not they have the option to move wherever they need to, depending on their certain circumstances, their health conditions, we need to have housing options that work for them regardless of their circumstance, their health circumstances. So what we'd want to see would be for older adults, because they say they want to remain in their homes and communities, to be able to access certain services in and around their home and community, so to support them prior to having to go into a more institutional setting, so that they would not necessarily have to face difficulties finding a specific residential facility to move into, and so that they can remain active and independent in their own communities.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get two more questions in 40 seconds. Dr. Malinsky, in a single sentence, if you'll indulge me, what is the single most significant driver of senior homelessness?
Housing costs. 2 words. Of course,
That's concise and effective. I'm going to follow up with you on the record. I want to direct one more question to our Cato witness, Mr. Michel. As concisely as you can, please, what do you assess to be the number one constraint on housing supply nationally?
I would have to go with zoning and land use restriction, zoning laws and land use restriction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I landed that at 5 minutes, and I yield.
5 minutes and 3 seconds. Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Sinema is recognized from her office, from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. You know, we have an obligation to ensure that all seniors can retire with dignity and respect. They've worked incredibly hard and deserve to enjoy their golden years with friends, family, and loved ones. However, far too many seniors in Arizona struggle to find affordable housing, and seniors among the most vulnerable to rising prices and rent increases. This year, Arizona was short about 270,000 housing units. The high levels of demand far outpaced the supply of housing units, which has accelerated the cost of rent. Dr. Malinsky, you have written about how America's housing stock is ill-suited to meet the needs of seniors. Can you explain some of the most common barriers to allowing seniors to age at home and the health implication of poorly designed homes that cannot meet a resident's physical ability?
Thank you, Senator. Yes. Affordability is a major one, as I've discussed, and the instability in the housing situation and the cutbacks and other things that people must do. The physical home, the majority of older adults live in single-family homes, which are among the least accessible housing in the country. We know that less than 1%, a very minuscule amount of housing is actually fully wheelchair accessible, should that be needed. Investing in housing to make it more accessible can be really challenging for a homeowner. Adding a bathroom on the first floor or something like that can be a challenge. The connections in the community are really important. Just given the issues with isolation and loneliness, we need to help people remain engaged and part of our community, part of our society. And then those services and supports in the home, as Mrs. Guzman mentioned, people are going to be needing more and more, but there's a huge gap at the bottom for low-income people, but also middle-income people who can't afford assisted living, who are going to be needing assistance in their homes.
Thank you. And Dr. Malinsky, how do you assess the state of the nation's public housing stock with respect to access for seniors and other people living with disabilities?
Yes, we used American Housing Survey data and compared the publicly assisted housing, public housing, and as well as project-based, and we compared that to the homes lived in by extremely low-income older renters who did not have assistance, and we found that public housing offers more accessibility, but still less than 20% of units have basic features like single-floor living, a no-step entrance, grab bars in the bathroom. We think that 35% or so could be made more accessible with some relatively simple investments. But it's better than what you find in the private market, but it is still in need of assistance to help people stay in their homes longer and more safely, particularly given the growth in the older population of public housing residents.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Guzman, thank you for being here. We're seeing a rise in homelessness in Arizona, including among our seniors. We have a safety net in place for people experiencing homelessness, but it is strained and it lacks resources. I also think that one challenge with the way that we've designed our safety net is that it often assumes that individuals who utilize the safety net can eventually return to work and build wealth to achieve financial independence. This is not possible for many seniors, and so many exhaust their eligibility for benefits without finding a viable financial path forward. Would you agree with this assessment, and can you share more about what AARP is seeing in Arizona and around the country with respect to seniors experiencing homelessness?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. What we're seeing is that older adults are dealing with rising prices, rising housing prices, rising prices for basic goods and services, and they're becoming financially strained. They're not able to pay for basic needs. So groceries, transportation, medical medications. We have an example of one older adult who had to sell his home in order to pay for his medications. And this is unacceptable. We need to make sure that at all income levels, including those who are teetering on the edge of homelessness, have adequate and affordable housing.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Senator Van Hollen is, I believe, from Maryland, is from his office.
Yes, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony today and talking about all the different elements that impact on the shortage of affordable housing for our seniors. And clearly the supply side is a big issue. A number of you have also mentioned the reality that seniors also need to be able to connect with services if they don't want to go into a more restricted setting. And so that is, of course, a key component. If you look at the Section 202 supportive housing for the elderly program, that's designed, as you know, to try to provide those services. But based on the information I've got, only about half of the individuals in that program who are already eligible for supportive services are able to access them. The funding is not sufficient. And so those individuals who might otherwise be able to use Section 202 housing, but also need these needs, would be kind of pushed into a more restrictive and higher cost settings. Ms. Guzman, you've mentioned this issue. Could you elaborate a little bit on that important piece of helping seniors age in place, the supportive services, and what happens if they're not available? What are their options?
Thank you, Senator. So AARP focuses on creating livable communities, and those are communities that have access to affordable housing options, accessible housing options, transportation, convenient transportation, access to healthy food options, and other amenities that can support aging, those who want to age in place. So access to places to exercise, being able to keep people active and engaged in community life will help them to live and remain in their communities for a longer period of time. So communities that don't have access to those, so people who live in communities that don't have access to those type of services and amenities really need the support of community organizations or local governments to help make those connections where possible. So that's through providing transportation options, making streets safer to walk, providing, again, a more affordable or a diverse range of housing options to meet their needs.
Thank you. And to Ms. Hammernick, in your experience, how big a gap is there currently in this link in allowing seniors to age in place in affordable settings?
I think it is all about resident services. And for Nevada Hand, that's what we fundraise for. We fundraise to pay for the salaries of our resident services coordinators. It's not to build buildings, right? It's for services. And I'll give you one quick example. One thing that we really encourage in our senior building are pets. And that may seem very strange in the landlord world, but we know that people with pets, especially seniors, walk them. And so we provide dog walks. It gets grandma up and moving, and we think that that's terrific. We have exercise rooms and all those things too, but pets help.
And in terms of the Section 202 funds for these wraparound services, in your experience, are those easily accessible, or has there been a big shortage there?
We've not experienced problems with that. We have some 202 buildings, and they have services that are right next door to buildings that aren't 202, that are more LIHTC model, and we've not experienced problems with that.
Got it. Dr. Molinsky, if you could comment on this, because I have seen reports that only about half of the folks who are eligible for the wraparound services under 202 are able to get them. I don't know if you have any comment on this piece of the challenge.
Senator, thank you. I don't have any data on the share who's accessed them, but I know that they are limited and that they are incredibly beneficial. We've done some work during the pandemic about the role that service coordinators played in stepping in to ensure people had food and medicine and were socially engaged, even though they couldn't necessarily leave the building or the apartment. So a very important component.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony today.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to follow up on some of the comments, slightly different direction, but some of the comments that Senator Van Hollen was making about the 202 supportive housing. And I want to direct these to Dr. Molinsky. I raised yesterday with our O&B director in a different hearing. We've all seen rents go up, about 14%. Some places that are actually even doubled. We've seen the increasing shortage of housing supply, particularly I see in Virginia in rural communities. The chairman and I have worked on initiatives where we can try to increase the amount of housing supply, particularly for low and moderate income. When we think about seniors, kind of within the overall universe here, Dr. Molinsky, in the president's budget, he put that $966 million into this program about housing supply, around wraparound services, some of the things that Senator Van Hollen was talking about around wraparound. How do we, are there things, how will President Biden's budget address the housing supply issue, and are there other things we should be looking at?
Thank you for the question. Certainly housing supply for especially low-income, older renters is incredibly important. We simply don't have enough to serve the people that we have in need and who are eligible right now, given and hence those long waiting lists that we talked about. and having those wraparound services are a key component of that for all the reasons that that we've discussed and Mrs. Guzman discussed. I think that one of the benefits of these programs is that they are deeply affordable, that they serve people at 30% of income or lower, and that is really hard to find outside of these subsidy models, these important housing programs.
Well, one of the things I want, and I'll stay with you on this topic, Dr. Malinsky. Another issue that a lot of us on the committee has tried to take on is the challenges around racial wealth gap, and a lot of that racial wealth gap is due to home ownership. And one of the things I'm concerned about is that one racial wealth gap, Black and white families happens at a young age, also happens at folks who are seniors, and the number of African American seniors and people of color seniors who are having to kind of dispose of their equity in their later years, or and you and the folks at the Joint Center, looked at these issues as we address senior housing on how we can also take on some of these questions around racial wealth gap.
Yes, the racial wealth gap in homeownership is striking among those 65 and over. It's at a high of 20 percentage points with white households. So this is definitely, and the disparity has widened since the recession. So this is definitely a concern. And when I mentioned earlier that the median older renter has a net wealth of $6,000, that compares to the median homeowner who has $343,000. So there's really important reasons for bolstering homeownership, especially among younger people, so that they can carry that equity into older age. But for now, helping older adults access equity in their homes is going to be important, and helping them do so in a way that is the best choice for them. So whether that's a reverse mortgage or some other method, that will be an important part of the conversation too.
Well, I would just say, and this is an issue I worked again with the chairman on, in the reconciliation package, we had I think a very creative effort that was geared at first generation, first time home buyers, which by definition are 2/3 basically people of color, that would, along with a little bit of down payment assistance, would literally have created, if you could afford a 30-year mortgage, it would have provided you a 20-year mortgage. The effect of that payment system would have doubled your equity in about 10 years. And if we're going to take on this issue, I think we're going to have to be creative, not only in terms of down payment assistance, but really some of these issues that will address the ability to build equity at a rapid rate. And look forward, Mr. Chairman, to continue working with you and folks on the committee on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The affordable housing crisis has affected families across the country who are struggling to keep up with rising housing costs. And America's seniors, who often live on fixed incomes that can't meet the demands of unrelenting rent increases, have been hit especially hard. Manufactured homes that are factory built and anchored on a plot of land, have become an essential source of housing for seniors who are looking to own their own homes and be able to age in place. Nearly half of the more than 22 million Americans who live in manufactured housing are seniors. Ms. Guzman, you are an expert on older Americans' housing needs, so let me ask you, what are the characteristics of manufactured housing that makes it a desirable alternative for seniors?
Thank you, Senator Warren. So manufactured housing is cheaper to build than single-family housing, and they are a more affordable option for older adults. They're also located in communities where they're clustered together. And so this allows for residents to get together socially. It also allows for delivery of services, certain services, because they're clustered together, so in-home care or Meals to Wheels programs. But there are limitations to manufactured housing in that they're not allowed everywhere. They're not allowed to be developed everywhere.
So let's get into this. So what you're telling me, though, is when you can get a community together of manufactured housing, it can be a terrific alternative for seniors.
Yes.
Because of affordability, because of the fact that people can come together. Manufactured housing, however, is not just attractive to seniors. A few decades ago, manufactured housing communities were generally owned by mom and pop businesses. But as the population aged and our housing supply has dwindled, the smell of money lured new players, and those are the big investors. So private equity firms, hedge funds, other Wall Street giants have scooped up manufactured home communities across the country, including those like Sandcastle Estates and Liberty Estates in Massachusetts that cater exclusively to seniors. Institutional investors accounted for nearly 1/4 of manufactured housing park purchases between 2019 and 2021, a 10 percentage point jump in just 2 years. Dr. Malinsky, you lead research on seniors' access to safe and affordable housing. So let me ask you the same question I asked Ms. Guzman, but this time about the giant investors. What characteristics of manufactured home communities, particularly those that cater to seniors, make them so attractive to Wall Street?
Thank you, Senator Warren. Yeah, these investments can be very profitable. Residents typically own their homes but rent the land underneath in these communities. So an investor purchasing a community can raise the lot rent and other fees. This can put residents in a bind. The cost of moving their homes can be more than they can afford or even physically impossible, and the increased rent can make it harder to resell a home. So residents have few alternatives but to pay the increased rent, but for those on fixed incomes, this means less left over for food and medication and healthcare trade-offs that we often see when housing is unaffordable. And for older adults in particular, a move can be disruptive, taking people away from support networks and community.
Yeah, make no mistake, trapping tenants is a key part of the investment strategy. And we know this because investors actually say it out loud. One online investor boot camp for those interested in manufactured housing investments states, and I quote here, "The fact that tenants can't afford the $5,000 it costs to move a mobile home keeps revenues stable and makes it easy to raise rents without losing any occupancy." End quote. In fact, according to one analyst report, since 2000, manufactured housing is the only real estate asset class that hasn't experienced any annual decline in operating income in any year. With the money from big rent hikes and exorbitant fees rolling in and protection against people moving out, why wouldn't it produce huge profits? So Wall Street investors buying up manufactured home communities threatens the remaining affordable housing stock that seniors rely on. It threatens the remaining, it means that seniors have fewer opportunities to age in their own homes and that they risk being squeezed out by rising rents, leaving them with even less money to buy medicine and to put food on the table. Congress needs to act to weaken the investors' grip on the housing market. And I want to thank you both for your work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. I'm going to do something I normally don't do. There's one more questioner that could not get here, and she represents Mr. Hammernick. So Senator Cortez Masto, and plus because Carol, her assistant, is from Cleveland, I make special allowance here. And she had a fall. I won't go into that, but anyway. So, but I have one question, Ms. Hammernick, before we wrap the meeting up. So this is coming from Senator Cortez Masto. I'm proud of the quality homes Nevada hand provides to residents of our state. Thank you for serving low-income seniors, people with disabilities, families, and veterans. And Senator Cortez Masto is in the Finance Committee today and the Energy Committee and just couldn't get here. Over the past 5 years, she writes, I've worked to get federal and other funds to Nevada Hand and other groups so you can build and operate more affordable homes. It's great to see more than 4,000 new homes under construction, 2,400 new homes preserved in the past year. So the question she has of you, Ms. Hammernick, if the Senate passed the Build Back Better bill that passed the House in November, we would have had funds to build and preserve more than 2 million homes nationwide. If we were able to expand the low-income housing tax credit as proposed in the Affordable Housing Credit Act, what would Nevada Hand be able to do with that expansion?
It would mean that we would probably be able to have more than one 9% award of tax credits a year. And that could mean around 200 to 250 new affordable apartments being built in Nevada. So it's just increased supply of this deeply needed resource.
Okay, thank you. And her other question is, what could Nevada Hand have done with increases, or what could it do with increases in successful housing construction programs run by HUD, like HOME, H-O-M-E, the Housing Trust Fund, Section 202 Elderly, and Section 811 People with Disabilities, all we were working to negotiate as part of, we hope, part of that legislation. So tell us what you could have done with that, Ms. Hammernick.
202, we've talked about that a little bit today, housing and services for seniors, and Dr. Malinsky talked about it too. It's very deeply for low-income folks. So we could really hit the very lowest, most vulnerable seniors. 811, folks with disability, we would love to participate. We have nothing in our portfolio right now, but we would love to be a part of that program. And more vouchers for states like Nevada, where we have increasing population, always helps us hit lower income folks.
Thank you. I care about Nevada, but I care more about Ohio. And I know that the questions that Senator Cortez Masto submitted for me to ask would make, if we could do those, would make huge differences in urban areas in my state and rural areas in my state too. And we have the housing crises at least as acute as most other places in the country. To the witnesses, to the 5 of you, 3 in person, 2 remote, thanks for being here. I'd like to enter in the record a statement submitted by Leading Age on the need for senior housing investment. Without objection, so ordered. For senators who wish to submit questions, for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today by April 7th. To the witnesses, please, you have 45 days. We ask you to respond to any of those questions that you get 45 days from the time you receive them. With that, the hearing is adjourned.